There are stories that fade like fog at dawn, and then there are stories that cling to the mind, like shadows that refuse to lift. The horror television movies of the 1970s and 1980s were crafted for quiet living rooms, yet they struck with the force of nightmares. These are the tales that still haunt viewers today. Number 10. The Intruder Within, 1981. There are horror tales built on shadows and whispers, and then there are stories that crawl straight out of the deepest fissures of the earth, carrying something ancient, something hungry, and something that should never have been touched by human hands. The Intruder Within is one of those rare, made-for-television nightmares from the early 1980s that manages to feel both cosmic and claustrophobic at the same time. It unfolds aboard a remote offshore drilling rig, surrounded by miles of endless water and an unforgiving sky, where every creak of metal and every sudden shift of wind feels like a warning that no one on this platform will be allowed to leave unchanged. This film was not designed to entertain in the safe, familiar way most television movies of its era tried to do. It was crafted to disturb, to curl into the subconscious, and remain there like a dormant organism waiting for the right moment to awaken. The story begins with a drilling team punching into a geological pocket that should have stayed sealed in prehistoric silence. What they unwittingly release is not simply a creature, but an evolutionary secret that predates humanity. The organism takes shape slowly at first, shifting, insinuating, influencing the physical world in violent, unpredictable ways. Soon the crew realizes they are trapped not only by ocean and isolation, but by a monster that adapts with every kill, learning, growing, and transforming into something more intelligent and more relentless than any of them can fathom. The fear becomes primal. The sense of enclosure becomes suffocating. The once familiar metal corridors of the drilling station now resemble the interior of a predator, waiting to swallow them whole. What truly elevates The Intruder Within, however, is its raw atmosphere. The wind blasts against the rig like an angry spirit. The lights flicker with every surge of tension. The practical effects born of handmade ingenuity give the monster a physicality that modern digital creatures rarely achieve. The film whispers themes of human arrogance, environmental intrusion, and the terrifying truth that nature holds grudges far older than mankind. By the time the final confrontation erupts, the viewer feels bruised by suspense, pressed into a corner by dread, and haunted by the realization that sometimes survival is not victory, but merely delay. Number 9. The Possessed, 1977. There is a special kind of terror born from the belief that evil does not need to knock because it has already found a way inside. The Possessed is one of those rare made-for-television horror films that radiates a sinister stillness, the kind that settles into the corners of a room and observes you with cold, patient intention. Released in the late 1970s, a decade gripped by fascination with supernatural dread, this story follows a mysterious wave of violent, inexplicable fires erupting across a Catholic boarding school for young women. These fires do not behave like accidents, nor like mistakes. They behave like messages. What elevates The Possessed beyond its era is the tone of mounting spiritual paranoia. The school feels ancient, despite its modern surroundings cloaked in whispers, rigid discipline, and unspoken fear. The students sense something watching them. The nuns hear unseen footsteps during late hours. And when a former priest, plagued by guilt, arrives to investigate, he encounters a horror that seems tightly coiled around the foundations of the institution itself. This is not a demon that announces itself loudly. It is a presence that suffocates faith, corrodes hope, and pressures the human soul from within until it finally breaks. The film thrives on atmosphere, long, dim corridors, doors that move when no one is near, a quietness so profound it feels like breath being held by something unseen. The soundtrack swells with low, unsettling tones that never explode into chaos, but instead vibrate beneath the skin. The special effects rely on shadow's suggestion and sudden violent ignition, as if flame itself has become a living entity. The result is horror rooted not in spectacle, but in spiritual contamination. As the mystery unfolds, The viewer is drawn deeper into a puzzle built not from clues, but from dread, from the idea that possession is not simply invasion, but transformation. Even today, devoted fans argue that the final act delivers some of the most chilling confrontations in 70s television horror. The possessed endures because it captures a terrifying idea that evil is patient, that it waits, and that it knows exactly where to find us. Number 8. Ghost Story. 1974. Ghost Story is one of the most atmospheric, slow-burning supernatural films ever produced for television, a tale that does not chase scares, but rather drifts through them like a cold night wind, carrying secrets too heavy to remain buried. At its heart is a lonely widower, a man haunted not by grief alone, but by the strange, ethereal presence of a woman whose connection to him unfurls with ghostly tenderness and spiraling dread. From the moment the story begins, the world is painted in muted tones, soft light, and uneasy silence. It feels less like a movie and more like a seance captured on celluloid. What makes Ghost Story unforgettable is its willingness to let fear bloom slowly. Nothing lunges, nothing shrieks. Instead, the supernatural elements linger in doorways, float through shadows, and reveal themselves only when the audience has been drawn deeply enough into the emotional quiet of the tale. The widower senses glimpses of the strange woman, then hints of her past, then the awful truth wrapped around her tragic fate. The film's pacing is deliberate, creating a haunting rhythm that mirrors the beating of a heart trying to remember something long forgotten. The apparition itself is not portrayed as a wild, violent force, but as a sorrowful presence tethered to a devastating, unfinished story. This makes the horror more intimate and more cutting. The living and the dead are bound together by guilt, longing, and a mystery that refuses to rest. The cinematography uses wide, empty spaces to emphasize loneliness, while close shots tighten around the widower's growing fear as he uncovers the story he was never meant to hear. The film's emotional weight deepens every supernatural occurrence until the viewer feels as if they too are being followed by a grief that does not end with death. Ghost Story remains a cult classic because it does something astonishing. It proves that horror can be gentle, silent, melancholic, and still utterly terrifying. It seeps into the viewer's thoughts and stays there like a ghost, learning the shape of your mind. Number 7. Satan's Triangle, 1975. There is a special dread that comes from the ocean, a dread built on endless horizons, and the knowledge that what hides beneath the waves has no obligation to obey the rules of our world. Satan's Triangle embraces that dread with fearless ambition, crafting one of the most unnerving maritime horror films ever created for television. It opens with a Coast Guard rescue crew responding to a distress call near the infamous Bermuda Triangle, where time, folklore, and terror crash together like storm tides. When they arrive, they find a lone survivor aboard a seemingly abandoned yacht, and nothing about her story feels anchored to reality. From the moment the rescue begins, the atmosphere thickens. The sea lies disturbingly calm as though waiting. The yacht is frozen in eerie stillness. The survivor speaks in fragmented half-truths, hinting at an unseen presence that claimed the others with unimaginable force. As the narrative unfolds, the film twists perception with every quiet revelation. Dead bodies appear in impossible positions. Sounds echo from empty spaces. Reality bends just slightly off-center, creating a surreal terror that feels more like a nightmare than a haunting. The tension escalates through masterful restraint. Every scene hums, with the suggestion that something unholy hovers just outside the frame, watching, waiting, deciding. The rescuer becomes trapped, not only physically, but psychologically caught between the survivor's soft, unnerving voice and the oppressive silence of the open sea. The film toys with spiritual themes, hinting that the ocean may not simply hide natural danger, but a gateway to forces that predate humanity. The final act detonates with one of the most iconic twist endings in television horror, leaving viewers stunned, breathless, and desperate to rewind the events in their minds. Satan's Triangle haunts because it denies closure, it denies pattern, it denies logic. It suggests that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers across still water, wearing the face of someone who begs to be saved. Number 6. Dark Night of the Scarecrow, 1981. Some horror films are content to frighten and then fade. But Dark Night of the Scarecrow is the kind of story that roots itself deep into the soil of memory, like an old curse waiting for the right season to bloom again. This made-for-television masterpiece stands as one of the most unsettling revenge tales ever broadcast into American homes. The fear does not begin with the supernatural. It begins with cruelty, with a small town, gripped by prejudice and suspicion, where innocence is crushed beneath the boots of men who believe they will never face judgment for the evil they commit. The story centers on Bubba Ritter, a gentle, mentally challenged man who finds joy only in the simple things and in the friendship of a young girl. When the girl is attacked and presumed dead, the townsmen, fueled by rage and ignorance, hunt Bubba down. They find him hiding inside a scarecrow disguise, pleading with silent eyes for mercy that never comes. What follows is a killing so brutal and heartless that it poisons the very air of the community. When the truth emerges that Bubba was innocent, the men believe the worst is behind them. But in horror, there is always a debt, and debts demand payment. Dark Night of the Scarecrow becomes a masterpiece of restrained terror as each guilty man begins to sense a watchful presence in the fields. A shadow that never moves, but always seems closer. A scarecrow that should not be able to stand where it does. The fear grows slowly, methodically, like frost creeping across a window pane. The deaths unfold not with spectacle, but with poetic inevitability, suggesting that justice is sometimes older and far more terrifying than the laws written by men. The cinematography drenches each scene in tension, with lonely roads, whispering with wind, and empty fields, stretching like haunted cathedrals. What makes this film endure is its moral gravity. The horror is righteous. The vengeance feels carved from ancient myth. And by the end, viewers feel the full weight of the message. Evil done in secret will not remain buried. The fields remember. The earth remembers. And sometimes something rises from that memory, wearing the shape of a scarecrow to reclaim what was stolen. Number 5. The Night Strangler, 1973. There is a restless energy in The Night Strangler, a sense that something dangerous moves beneath the surface of every shadowed alley, every abandoned basement, and every whispered secret buried beneath historic streets. This sequel to The Night Stalker returns with investigative reporter Carl Kolchak, a man whose relentless pursuit of the abnormal places him toe-to-toe with horrors that thrive in the dark spaces of civilization. The film unfolds in the labyrinth beneath Seattle, where cold tunnels and forgotten passages hide a truth so ancient and vile that even the city itself seems unwilling to acknowledge it. Kolchak begins tracking a series of murders that repeat every 21 years, each victim drained of life in ways that defy natural explanation. As he pushes deeper into the investigation, he collides with a figure who should not exist, a killer who has mastered an impossible secret tied to immortality and alchemical ritual. The suspense tightens around every step Kolchak takes, as though the tunnels press inward, watching with unseen eyes. Each discovery feels like peeling back the skin of a monster, revealing sinew bone and history fused into something monstrous. The film succeeds because it grounds supernatural terror in gritty, journalistic realism. Kolchak is not a hero carved from legend. He is a stubborn, flawed man who refuses to bow to authority or fear. His determination becomes the engine that drives the narrative into darker and darker territory until he finally confronts the horror face to face. The Night Strangler balances pulp energy with genuine dread, giving the audience a villain who is more tragic than demonic, more driven by twisted intellect than blind hunger. This complexity deepens the horror and leaves viewers with a lingering chill that intellectual evil can be as terrifying as supernatural evil. Even decades after its release, The Night Strangler stands as one of the finest horror mysteries crafted for television. It merges atmosphere, action, and suspense into a relentless pursuit of a killer who should not exist, and a truth that refuses to stay buried beneath the city streets. It haunts because it reminds us that history has dark corners and some things should stay forgotten. Number 4. The Night Stalker, 1972. Few television movies have ever changed an entire genre the way The Night Stalker did. Before its release, horror on television was often polite, restrained, and hesitant to cross the boundary between suspense and true fear. But The Night Stalker shattered that boundary with a force that echoed through the decades, birthing a legacy that inspired countless filmmakers, storytellers, and series creators. At its heart is Karl Kolchak, a relentless reporter whose instincts pull him toward mysteries others dismiss as fantasy or hysteria. This time, his instincts drag him directly into the path of a predator who defies nature itself. Set in the neon-soaked streets of Las Vegas, the story tracks a series of murders marked by drained bodies, shattered bones, and an aura of terror that blankets the city. Authorities deny any supernatural angle, but Kolchak pieces together a chilling possibility. The killer may not be human at all. It may be a vampire walking boldly through modern America, feeding without remorse and intelligent enough to outmaneuver every attempt to capture it. This premise alone electrified viewers in 1972 when the idea of a real vampire in a contemporary setting felt dangerously subversive. The tension grows with every scene as Kolchak races against time, battling disbelief bureaucracy and a creature whose strength makes confrontation nearly suicidal. The film masterfully blends investigative thriller elements with classic monster horror, creating a hybrid style that remains influential to this day. The violence surprised audiences with its boldness, and the creature design, though modest by modern standards, remains deeply effective because it relies not on spectacle, but on presence, on a primal sense of something predatory moving through the night. The Night Stalker endures because it understands fear. It understands isolation, the panic of being unheard, the terror of discovering a truth too horrifying for anyone to accept. Kolchak becomes the lone voice in a city drowning in denial, and that loneliness becomes the emotional core of the film. By the explosive final confrontation, the viewer feels every ounce of tension that has been building like storm pressure. The Night Stalker still haunts because it revealed a brutal idea. Monsters do not hide in castles. They walk beside us beneath neon signs and city lights, waiting for darkness to fall. Number 3. Salem's Lot, 1979. There are horror stories that chill the skin, and then there are horror stories that freeze the soul. Salem's Lot belongs to the second category, a tale so saturated with dread that even today viewers remember scenes that scarred their childhoods forever. When this made-for-television adaptation of Stephen King's novel premiered, audiences did not expect such overwhelming darkness. Yet, what unfolded on screen felt less like a broadcast film and more like a haunting that slipped through the television set to settle inside every living room. The story follows writer Ben Mears returning to the quiet town of Salem's Lot to confront his past, only to discover that something ancient and hungry has entered the community. A vampire of mythic power has taken residence in the old Marston house, and its influence spreads like a disease, seeping into families, neighbors, and children with insidious intent. The film thrives on atmosphere, using silent shadows and slowly building unease to create a landscape where daylight feels weak and nightfall feels like an approaching executioner. The scenes of levitating children, scratching softly against bedroom windows, have become legend. No music, no spectacle, only the unbearable tension of the supernatural intruding gently upon the innocence of childhood. It is this restraint that makes Salem's Lot terrifying. The monster is not a roaring beast, but a force that moves with deliberate purpose, choosing victims with the cold efficiency of a predator that knows it cannot be stopped. As the infection spreads, the town collapses into fear, paranoia, and despair, giving the film a sense of apocalyptic inevitability. Ben Mears becomes an unwilling warrior, forced to battle not only the ancient vampire, but the frailty of hope itself. The final assault on the Marston house burns with desperate energy as every moment feels like a countdown toward inevitable doom. Salem's Lot remains iconic because it captures the essence of creeping evil. Evil that does not need to shout. Evil that simply waits at your window, smiling softly in the dark. Number 2. Trilogy of Terror, 1975. Few television films have engraved themselves into pop culture nightmares the way Trilogy of Terror has. On the surface, it appears as a simple anthology, 3 stories bound together by the powerhouse performance of Karen Black. But beneath that structure beats a heart of pure dread. Each segment feels like a descent into a different flavor of madness, but it is the final story, the infamous tale of the Zuni fetish doll, that transformed this film into a generational trauma. The first two segments already unsettle the viewer, with shifting identities, manipulation, and psychological breakdowns. Karen Black plays wildly different characters, each unraveling under circumstances that blur the boundary between control and terror. But nothing prepares the audience for the vicious energy that erupts in the third story, where a tiny ancient warrior doll possessed by a violent spirit springs to life with relentless fury. What follows is not elegant horror, but savage primal panic. The creature attacks with animalistic intensity, turning a woman's apartment into a battleground of survival where every corner hides potential death. The choreography of fear is ruthless. The small figure moves with impossible speed, scraping, clawing, and lunging with a hunger for violence that feels disturbingly human. The sound, the clatter of its weapon, the rapid pattering of its steps becomes a soundtrack of terror that burrows into the brain. Karen Black's frantic performance drives the horror to a breaking point as she fights an enemy far smaller, yet far more ferocious than any human killer. And then the ending arrives, a cruel, unforgettable twist that freezes the entire anthology into a single horrifying image, one that still appears in nightmares decades later. Trilogy of Terror remains a masterpiece, not because of grand visual effects, but because it understands velocity, desperation, and the terror of losing control inside one's own home. It taught audiences that horror could be small, fast, and merciless, and that sometimes the most frightening monsters stand no taller than a child's toy. Number 1. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, 1973. There are many horror films that scare audiences, but very few permanently alter the way viewers feel about the dark corners of their homes. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is one such phenomenon. This made-for-television film whispered its terror rather than shouted it, and in doing so created one of the most psychologically destructive viewing experiences ever aired into American households. The terror here is intimate, domestic, and deceptively quiet. It lives in vents and shadows, in the forgotten spaces beneath old houses where something ancient waits to reclaim its place in the world. The story follows Sally, a woman who moves with her husband into a sprawling old home filled with secrets she is not meant to uncover. When she opens a sealed fireplace, she unknowingly frees small demonic creatures who crawl from darkness with whispering voices and malicious intent. They are not beasts of spectacle. They are tiny, they are patient, and they are horrifyingly intelligent. Their power lies in invasion, the belief that your safest spaces can be breached by things too small to fight and too persistent to escape. Every scene builds dread, not through loud scares, but through slow, creeping inevitability. A voice calling Sally's name, footsteps that should not exist, objects moved ever so slightly, and always the whispered promise, "We want you, Sally." The terror becomes inescapable as Sally tries desperately to convince those around her that something supernatural is unfolding, while everyone dismisses her fear as nerves, imagination, or hysteria. This isolation becomes the film's most powerful weapon, transforming her descent into a tragedy that feels sickeningly real. The creatures themselves emerge only in fleeting glimpses, yet each appearance leaves the viewer shaken. They move with unnerving purpose, their faces twisted with eerie, mischievous delight. By the time the finale arrives, the viewer has been pulled into a nightmare of inevitability, one that does not end with rescue or justice, but with horrifying surrender. The final moments are among the bleakest ever broadcast on television. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark remains the most haunting horror TV movie because it understood a simple truth. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the shadows, waiting for you to listen. Some nightmares lose their power with age, but the greatest horror tales grow darker each time they are remembered. These 10 haunting classics prove that fear survives across decades, waiting patiently in the corners of memory. Revisit them if you dare, and let the shadows remind you that terror never truly ends.